Late one evening in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a quiet diplomatic signal was sent thousands of miles away toward Tehran. There were no dramatic headlines at first, no emergency meetings broadcast on television, and no immediate reaction from the world's major powers. But behind closed doors, something significant was beginning to take shape. A small West African nation, long overshadowed in global politics, was preparing to take a step that could quietly alter the balance of influence across the African continent. At the center of this story stands one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who rose to power in Burkina Faso, promising a different future for his country. Since taking office, Traoré has repeatedly argued that Africa must no longer rely on a single group of international partners to secure its future. Instead, he believes the continent must build a wider network of alliances capable of protecting its sovereignty, its resources, and its people. Now that vision appears to be moving into a new phase. In recent weeks, Burkina Faso has begun deepening strategic discussions with Iran, a country that, like Burkina Faso, has often found itself at odds with Western powers. The topics under discussion are not small. Defense cooperation, energy development, industrial partnerships, and new trade mechanisms are all part of the conversation. For some observers, this emerging partnership signals the birth of a new geopolitical alignment in the Sahel region. For others, it raises concerns about how global powers might respond if Africa begins shifting its alliances in unexpected directions. Yet, beyond the headlines and diplomatic language, lies a deeper question that many Africans are beginning to ask. What does true independence look like in a world where economic power, military alliances, and financial systems are still largely controlled by a handful of dominant nations? As Burkina Faso explores partnerships with Iran, Russia, and Turkey, the country may be testing an idea that could reshape Africa's geopolitical future. But is this bold strategy the beginning of a new era of African sovereignty, or the opening move in a much larger global confrontation? If this story about Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and the changing direction of Africa matters to you, stay with me, because what happens next may surprise the world. The turning point in this story began with a diplomatic visit that few outside geopolitical circles initially noticed. A delegation from Burkina Faso, led by senior government officials, including the country's defense leadership, traveled to Tehran, the capital of Iran. On the surface, the meeting looked like a routine diplomatic exchange. Nations meet, officials shake hands, statements about cooperation are released, and the world moves on. But the conversations taking place behind those doors carried far deeper implications for the future of the Sahel region. According to officials familiar with the discussions, Burkina Faso's representatives arrived with a clear objective: to explore a strategic partnership that could strengthen the country's security, industrial capacity, and economic independence. For years, Burkina Faso has struggled with armed insurgencies that threaten rural communities and disrupt national stability. Entire villages have faced displacement as extremist groups exploit weak borders and fragile infrastructure. For a farmer living near the northern frontier, security is not an abstract political concept. It determines whether crops can be harvested safely, whether children can walk to school, and whether markets remain open. One local farmer in the Sahel region described the situation simply: when security disappears, everything disappears. That reality has shaped the priorities of Ibrahim Traoré's government. Strengthening national defense has become an urgent mission, and that is where Iran's experience enters the picture. Despite decades of international sanctions, Iran has developed a significant domestic defense industry. The country has invested heavily in drone technology, missile systems, and military engineering, often focusing on cost-effective solutions designed to operate under difficult conditions. For Burkina Faso, these technologies could play an important role in monitoring remote desert regions, where insurgent groups often move undetected. Surveillance drones, for example, could help security forces track militant activity across vast stretches of territory, where traditional patrols are difficult. Iranian officials, for their part, expressed interest in expanding cooperation with African partners. During the meetings, Iran's leadership signaled that Africa was becoming an increasingly important priority in its foreign policy strategy. In particular, Iran's president emphasized the potential for bilateral partnerships with Burkina Faso in several sectors, including science, industry, energy development, and defense cooperation. But the potential partnership extends beyond security. Economic collaboration also formed a central part of the discussions. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's significant gold producers, with gold accounting for a large share of the country's export revenue. Iran, meanwhile, is seeking new trade relationships as it navigates restrictions within the global financial system. Analysts believe both countries may be exploring alternative mechanisms that allow trade using local currencies rather than relying on the US dollar. Such arrangements are not entirely new. Similar ideas have been discussed in global economic forums where countries seek ways to reduce exposure to currency-based sanctions or financial pressure. For Burkina Faso, a local currency trade system could provide greater flexibility when building international partnerships. For Iran, it opens new markets and diplomatic relationships across the African continent. Yet the implications of these discussions extend even further when viewed in the broader regional context. Burkina Faso is not the only Sahel nation exploring alternative alliances. Neighboring Niger, another country rich in natural resources, has reportedly explored defense cooperation with Iran as well. In exchange for advanced military systems such as surface-to-air missile technology, Iran could gain access to strategic mineral resources, including uranium, an element essential for nuclear energy development. Mali, another key player in the Sahel region, has also expressed interest in technical collaboration related to drone manufacturing and aircraft maintenance. In return, Mali may offer agricultural access and mineral resources such as gold to its partners. Viewed individually, each of these agreements may appear limited in scope, but taken together, they suggest a broader pattern emerging across the region. Countries once tied primarily to Western security frameworks are now experimenting with diversified partnerships that include actors from across the global geopolitical spectrum. From Tehran to Moscow to Ankara, new diplomatic channels are opening across Africa. For Ibrahim Traoré, this approach reflects a strategic principle often described in international politics as diversification of alliances. If one partner withdraws support, another may remain. If one economic pathway closes, another may open. In a region where political instability has often been exploited by external actors, building multiple partnerships may provide a form of strategic insurance. Yet this strategy also introduces new uncertainties, because whenever smaller nations begin reshaping alliances in ways that affect global influence, major powers inevitably begin paying closer attention. And that raises a question that now echoes through diplomatic circles far beyond Africa. How will the world's most powerful countries respond if the Sahel region begins building a new geopolitical network that operates outside traditional Western systems? News of the Tehran meeting did not remain quiet for long. Within diplomatic circles, reports of Burkina Faso's expanding partnerships began spreading quickly, and reactions soon followed from multiple directions across the international stage. What initially appeared to be a routine diplomatic outreach now started to look like something much larger: the emergence of a new geopolitical pattern in the Sahel. For supporters of Ibrahim Traoré, the developments represented a bold assertion of African sovereignty. In Ouagadougou, many citizens interpreted the diplomatic outreach as proof that their country was no longer willing to depend on a single group of international allies. Some local commentators praised the government's strategy as a form of political diversification, an attempt to ensure that Burkina Faso would never again find itself isolated if traditional partners withdrew support. On radio programs and community discussions across the country, a common argument began to surface. If powerful nations are free to build alliances around the world, why should African countries be expected to limit their choices? Yet outside Burkina Faso, the reactions were far more complex. Western analysts and policymakers began examining the implications of deeper cooperation between Sahel governments and countries such as Iran and Russia. For years, Western security policy in the region had been built on partnerships designed to combat extremist groups and support fragile governments. Now, however, those traditional frameworks were beginning to shift. Some policy experts in Europe expressed concern that alternative alliances could complicate existing security strategies. If multiple external actors begin operating simultaneously in the Sahel, each with their own priorities and strategic interests, the result could be a more fragmented and unpredictable geopolitical landscape. Others, however, offered a different interpretation. They argued that the growing network of partnerships reflected a broader transformation in global diplomacy. In today's world, smaller nations increasingly pursue what analysts call multi-alignment, a strategy in which countries maintain relationships with multiple major powers rather than aligning exclusively with one geopolitical bloc. From this perspective, Burkina Faso's diplomatic outreach may represent less of a confrontation and more of an attempt to navigate a rapidly changing international system. But the reactions were not limited to policymakers and analysts. The news also sparked intense discussions across African media and public discourse. In several West African countries, commentators began debating whether Burkina Faso's strategy could become a model for other nations seeking greater autonomy in global affairs. For decades, many African economies have relied heavily on trade systems, financial institutions, and military partnerships shaped by Western influence. The possibility that some countries might begin exploring alternative arrangements raised questions about whether a new chapter in African diplomacy might be emerging. Supporters of Traoré often frame his policies as part of a wider historical movement, one that seeks to redefine Africa's place in global politics after generations of colonial rule and economic dependence. In this narrative, the alliances with Iran, Russia, or Turkey are not merely tactical decisions, but symbolic steps toward a more independent future. Yet critics warn that such narratives can oversimplify complex realities. Building new alliances does not automatically guarantee stability or prosperity. Every international partnership carries risks, trade-offs, and political consequences. For example, deeper defense cooperation with external powers can introduce new security dynamics that reshape regional balance. Economic agreements involving natural resources may also raise questions about long-term sustainability and transparency. Within Burkina Faso itself, some observers emphasize that the ultimate measure of success will not be diplomatic headlines, but tangible improvements in everyday life. Will rural communities become safer? Will economic opportunities expand for young people? Will the country's natural resources generate lasting prosperity rather than short-term gains? These are the questions many citizens quietly ask as geopolitical strategies unfold around them. At the same time, the broader Sahel region is watching closely. Mali and Niger, both of which have also experienced major political transitions in recent years, appear to share a similar interest in diversifying their international partnerships. Together, these countries form a geographic corridor stretching across West Africa, a region rich in natural resources, yet historically vulnerable to instability. If multiple governments in the Sahel pursue comparable diplomatic strategies, the combined effect could gradually reshape the region's geopolitical orientation. This possibility has already drawn attention from international observers who see the Sahel as one of the most strategically important regions of the coming decades. With vast reserves of minerals, expanding populations, and growing economic potential, Africa as a whole is expected to play an increasingly central role in global markets and political alliances throughout the 21st century. That reality means developments in countries like Burkina Faso carry implications far beyond their borders. When alliances shift in a region this significant, the ripple effects can reach global institutions, energy markets, and international security systems. For this reason, the diplomatic moves initiated by Ibrahim Traoré are being studied not only in African capitals, but also in Washington, Brussels, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. Each of these global centers is trying to understand the same question. Is the Sahel region entering a new phase of geopolitical independence, or simply becoming the latest arena in an expanding competition among global powers? The answer may not emerge immediately. Diplomatic realignments unfold slowly, shaped by negotiations, economic realities, and the unpredictable dynamics of international politics. What is clear, however, is that Burkina Faso has begun testing a path that diverges from the historical patterns of its foreign policy. Whether this path leads to greater stability, stronger sovereignty, or new geopolitical tensions remains uncertain. But as alliances form and reactions continue to unfold across the international community, one fact has become impossible to ignore. A small nation in the Sahel has suddenly placed itself at the center of a much larger global conversation. And as the world watches these developments unfold, the next chapter of this story may depend not only on diplomatic strategy, but on how global powers choose to respond in the months and years ahead. While diplomatic negotiations and geopolitical alliances dominate international headlines, the true impact of these strategic decisions will ultimately be felt far away from conference rooms and presidential palaces. In Burkina Faso, the consequences of Ibrahim Traoré's foreign policy choices will unfold in villages, markets, farms, and neighborhoods, where ordinary citizens confront the daily realities of insecurity, economic uncertainty, and political transformation. For many families living in rural regions of the Sahel, the most immediate concern remains safety. Armed insurgent groups have forced thousands of people to leave their homes over the past several years, creating large numbers of internally displaced families. Entire communities have been relocated to safer towns where humanitarian organizations struggle to provide food, shelter, and medical care. In these environments, discussions about international alliances are meaningful only if they lead to improved security conditions on the ground. If new defense partnerships help the government monitor remote territories, disrupt militant movements, and restore stability to rural areas, then the geopolitical strategy pursued by the government could gradually translate into a sense of safety returning to everyday life. A farmer who once abandoned his fields due to violence may finally return to harvest crops again. Local markets that closed due to insecurity could reopen, allowing communities to rebuild their economic activities. However, security improvements are only one part of the broader picture. Political transformation within Burkina Faso has also brought significant institutional changes. Since taking power, Ibrahim Traoré has emphasized national sovereignty and economic independence as central pillars of his leadership. This message resonates strongly with many citizens who believe that their country's vast natural resources, especially gold, should generate greater benefits for the national population. In recent years, Burkina Faso has taken steps to increase oversight of its mining sector and to reconsider how resource revenues are distributed. Supporters of these policies argue that stronger national control over strategic industries could help fund infrastructure projects, education programs, and public services that directly improve the lives of ordinary people. Yet political transitions also introduce uncertainty. Governments that pursue rapid policy shifts must balance reform with stability, ensuring that institutions remain capable of delivering essential services. Investors, both domestic and international, closely watch these developments when deciding whether to expand economic activity within the country. If policy reforms are perceived as unpredictable or overly confrontational toward existing partners, investment flows could slow, potentially affecting employment opportunities for young citizens entering the labor market. This tension between sovereignty and economic stability represents one of the central political challenges facing Burkina Faso today. On the regional level, the country's evolving alliances also influence relations with neighboring states and regional organizations. In West Africa, diplomatic cooperation has traditionally been coordinated through regional institutions that seek to maintain political stability and economic integration among member countries. When governments change course dramatically in their foreign policy orientation, these regional frameworks sometimes experience strain. Neighboring countries may face pressure to clarify their own diplomatic positions, especially when international powers view certain alliances with caution. Nevertheless, Burkina Faso's strategy of diversified partnerships could also create opportunities for new forms of regional cooperation. If neighboring countries, such as Mali and Niger, pursue similar paths of strategic independence, they may develop stronger coordination mechanisms focused on shared security challenges and economic development. Such cooperation could reshape how Sahel nations collaborate on border security, counter-terrorism operations, and regional infrastructure projects. At the heart of these developments lies a fundamental question that extends beyond Burkina Faso itself. Can African nations redesign their political and economic relationships with the wider world in a way that strengthens national sovereignty while still maintaining stability and growth? The answer will depend not only on diplomatic strategy, but on the practical outcomes experienced by citizens. If security improves, if economic opportunities expand, and if natural resources begin contributing more visibly to public welfare, then the policies pursued by Ibrahim Traoré may gain lasting support from the population. But if expectations rise faster than results appear, public pressure could also intensify. In this sense, the geopolitical decisions being made today represent more than foreign policy maneuvers. They are part of a larger national experiment in redefining the relationship between governance, sovereignty, and the everyday lives of millions of Burkinabe citizens. And as the country continues navigating these complex changes, another important dimension of the story remains to be explored: how the broader international community, especially major global powers, will interpret and respond to this emerging shift in Africa's political direction. As Burkina Faso expands its diplomatic relationships and explores new alliances, the international community has begun observing these developments with growing attention. In Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals, policymakers have long viewed the Sahel region as a strategic priority. The region sits at a crossroads between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and its stability is closely connected to issues such as migration, counterterrorism, and global resource markets. For decades, Western governments have invested military resources, development programs, and diplomatic initiatives aimed at stabilizing the region. From this perspective, the emergence of alternative partnerships involving countries such as Iran, Russia, or Turkey raises important strategic questions. Some Western analysts worry that increasing geopolitical competition in the Sahel could complicate ongoing security operations against extremist networks. Others fear that if multiple external powers become involved in the region simultaneously, coordination between international partners could become more difficult. However, not all observers interpret Burkina Faso's diplomatic strategy as a confrontation with the West. Some international experts suggest that the current developments reflect a broader transformation in global diplomacy. Around the world, many mid-sized and developing nations are increasingly adopting what scholars describe as multi-vector foreign policy, meaning they seek cooperative relationships with several major powers at the same time, rather than aligning exclusively with one geopolitical bloc. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America have experimented with similar strategies in recent years, balancing economic cooperation with different partners while maintaining political independence. In that sense, Burkina Faso's outreach to Iran, Russia, and Turkey may represent part of a wider global shift toward more diversified international relationships. At the same time, other global actors are carefully watching how these changes unfold. China, which has significantly expanded its economic presence across Africa through infrastructure investment and trade partnerships, continues to promote development cooperation across the continent. Russia has also strengthened diplomatic and security ties with several African governments in recent years. Meanwhile, international organizations and financial institutions remain involved in development programs aimed at addressing poverty, infrastructure needs, and humanitarian challenges in the Sahel region. All of these overlapping interests mean that Africa is becoming one of the most important arenas of international engagement in the 21st century. With its rapidly growing population, abundant natural resources, and expanding markets, the continent holds increasing geopolitical significance. In this evolving landscape, the diplomatic choices made by countries such as Burkina Faso will not occur in isolation. They will influence how global powers interact, compete, and cooperate within Africa's future development. And as new alliances emerge and international reactions continue to evolve, the world now faces a deeper question. Are we witnessing the early stages of a new geopolitical balance in Africa, or the beginning of a new contest for influence across one of the world's most important regions? As the diplomatic story surrounding Burkina Faso continues to unfold, one reality becomes increasingly clear. The decisions being made today in Ouagadougou may echo far beyond the borders of this small West African nation. What began as a quiet effort to expand international partnerships has gradually evolved into a symbol of a much larger conversation taking place across the African continent. For many citizens and observers, the policies pursued by Ibrahim Traoré represent an attempt to redefine the balance between sovereignty and dependence, between national control and external influence. In a world where economic systems, military alliances, and global trade networks are often dominated by powerful nations, the question of how smaller countries protect their autonomy has never been more important. Supporters of Burkina Faso's strategy argue that diversification of alliances is not a radical step, but a logical one. If a nation relies on only one group of partners, it becomes vulnerable whenever political relationships change. But when a country develops multiple partnerships across different regions of the world, it gains greater room to maneuver and negotiate. This philosophy, sometimes described by international scholars as strategic diversification, is increasingly visible across many parts of the developing world. Yet diversification also carries risks. Every new alliance introduces new expectations, new pressures, and new geopolitical calculations. When multiple global powers show interest in the same region, competition can intensify, and history has repeatedly shown that when global rivalries intersect with local challenges, smaller nations often face the most difficult choices. For Burkina Faso, the ultimate test of this diplomatic strategy will not be measured in international headlines, but in everyday realities within the country. Will security conditions improve for communities affected by conflict? Will economic partnerships create industries that provide long-term employment for young citizens? Will the nation's gold, agriculture, and natural resources contribute more directly to public prosperity rather than leaving the country through external channels? These are the questions that will determine whether the current political path becomes a turning point in Burkina Faso's history, or simply another chapter in the long struggle for stability in the Sahel region. At the same time, the broader African continent is entering a period of transformation. Population growth, technological expansion, and increasing economic integration are gradually shifting Africa's position in the global system. What once appeared to be a peripheral region of international politics is now becoming a central arena of global attention. Governments across the world, from Washington to Beijing, from Moscow to Brussels, are studying how Africa's future alliances might reshape global power dynamics. In that context, the decisions made by leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré carry significance beyond national borders. They contribute to a broader debate about how emerging nations define sovereignty in an interconnected world. Perhaps the most important lesson from this moment is that the future of Africa will not be determined by external powers alone. It will also be shaped by the choices of African governments, the resilience of African societies, and the determination of citizens who want their countries to stand with dignity on the global stage. Whether Burkina Faso's current strategy ultimately leads to greater stability, stronger independence, or new geopolitical challenges remains uncertain. But the conversation it has started is already reshaping how many people think about Africa's role in the world. And, as this story continues to evolve, one final question remains open for all of us watching from across the globe. Is Burkina Faso witnessing the birth of a new era of African sovereignty, or the beginning of a new geopolitical contest that will define the future of the Sahel for decades to come? If this story about Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and the future of Africa made you think, share your perspective in the comments. If you believe Africa deserves stability, dignity, and the freedom to shape its own path, consider supporting discussions like this by subscribing and joining the conversation. Because the story of Africa's future is still being written, and every voice that engages with these questions helps keep that conversation alive.